Cool. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Overview podcast. My name is Anshuk, and today we have a special guest with us, Tycho. Tycho is one of the other grad students in the Aeroastro department, and he's got a really interesting background. He's first year, and he's going to talk to us a lot about space capital and the new space industry today. But Tycho, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Tycho. I was actually named after an eccentric Danish astronomer who had his nose chopped off, and long story. But anyway, I've kind of had space in my life ever since birth.
Wow. Did your parents ever tell you why they named you Tycho?
Well, my mom's actually an astronomer, so that is the connection there.
Okay. So you grew around telescopes and everything.
Sort of. She was more, in the mathy sides of things.
Okay, cool. So I guess, do you want to talk about your background? Of course, it seems like you had space in your life from the very beginning, but how did you get into aerospace specifically, the engineering side? Maybe where do you go to undergrad, and how do you end up here, and things you've done along the way?
Yeah, sure, great. So I've always been interested in engineering. I went to this high school where there was actually a focus on engineering and got exposed to CAD and some circuitry and stuff like that. And I've always liked to build things. And then, of course, my mom, being an astronomer, definitely brought in that space aspect. And who doesn't look up at the stars and is full of wonder? And then I went to undergrad at Columbia University. They actually don't have a aerospace department or program. So I majored in mechanical engineering. And I started joining, some of the student groups pretty much on day one. One of them was, the Formula Racing team. But the other one was this club called the Columbia Space Initiative, which grew to become a huge part of my time there. And that's what really got me interested in space specifically. During those first few years of undergrad, I was working on the rocketry team, doing some fluid stuff. We were building a hybrid rocket, which was super cool. And then I remember specifically watching the Starship tests, back when they were just flipping the thing and not actually catching it with chopsticks nowadays. So that got me really excited about the space industry. And then my first internship was at the Air Force Research Lab out in Kirtland, New Mexico, where I was working on orbital debris shielding, which was pretty interesting. Obviously, orbital debris is this huge problem that the industry is going to have to come to terms with and come up with ideas on how to solve pretty soon. And it was really interesting to work on kind of the research and development side of how do we build a novel shield type. But of course, that was on the government side of things in the Air Force. There was those aspects too where it was kind of slow moving, but huge budgets and cool projects. Then over that next year, I was like, okay, I know I like space. I'd like to get a kind of different angle on the industry, which led me to intern at this company called Maxar, which is actually kind of just down the street from here. Yeah. But it's a satellite imaging company, and if the images that they took of the Russian troops moving to Ukraine, those were those people. I worked on orbital debris related projects in there as well, sort of helping come up with a debris shield design analysis program. And that was, again, really interesting. And now this is on the government contractor side of things. So again, sort of slow moving, but it actually, you're trying to make money. So it's a different kind of commercial incentive. You have to sell things, but again, mostly to the government. So that was a great, different perspective. And then at the same time, those Starship tests were accelerating and getting more and more exciting. And I remember reading a few books, Lift Off by Eric Berger comes to mind. And this was really gets me excited about the commercial space industry. So that led me to apply to this commercial space fellowship called the Matthews Ackwitz Fellowship, which I was lucky enough to receive. And basically that's focused on putting students that are interested in commercial space into the forefront of commercial space companies, giving them an internship and then a mentorship with some pretty incredible people. My mentor was actually the third employee at SpaceX, which is just crazy to pick his brain on things. So that summer I ended up at VAST, which is this commercial space station company that's trying to make the world's first commercial space station, and they're in that race with a few other companies. But that really opened my eyes to wow, this is the thing. Space is back in its golden age. We had the 1960s, but space is back. There's all these really cool commercial stuff, which got me super excited about not just the technology and the engineering side, which I was learning through classes and whatnot, but also the business side, like what makes a good space company? How are these companies going to make money in the future?
Yeah.
So that in turn led me to seek out this opportunity at Space Capital, which I was kind of lucky enough to know through Columbia and the club that I was leading there, Columbia Space Initiative at that point. I basically reached out to the investor, the people there. His name is Justice. He's a partner there. And they are kind of like the leader in producing research about the commercial space industry. They collect all the fundraising data and everything on the entire commercial space industry, which they publish, for free for anybody quarterly, along with these research reports. So I got to work on this incredible opportunity, which was doing a research report on Starship, and basically trying to answer the question of what is Starship going to change. A lot of people talk about Starship as, it's going to bring our launch cost to zero, and it's going to just send stuff. We're going to send stuff to space for free, and there wasn't too much discussion beyond like, what does this actually enable on the technical side, the use cases, and then in turn, are those use cases, do they have markets? Do they make sense? So we went about interviewing people and doing a survey, and then put it together into this final report, which again is on their website if you want to check it out. But anyway, I'm kind of going on and on. But that got me excited about the commercial space industry. And then on top of that, I was also like, I really want to dive into guidance navigation control as a technical field. And Stanford's obviously one of the best places in the world to do that. So that led me over to here, which has been amazing so far. Stanford's this incredible, place that has both the engineering might, but also the startup entrepreneurial aspects. So I'm getting to dabble in both those worlds, which I'm finding incredible so far. So, yeah, that's a good summary, I guess.
Cool. Yeah, I guess there's a lot to unpack there. I think the first thing is going back to your undergrad experience. It seems like your first few experiences were with orbital shielding. Like, I didn't realize multiple of your first internships were related to the same topic. Is that what you did at VAST as well, or you went like a completely different direction with VAST, kind of looking for something else?
Yeah, no, I did something different. I mean, orbital debris shielding has a special place in my heart.
Yeah.
It's really interesting, but it's not really the forefront, and I definitely wanted to try something new. So for VAST, I was actually working on analyzing the sloshing of fuel in the spacecraft in their whole space station, which is a super interesting problem. Actually, kind of is what got me interested in GNC, because I interfaced with the GNC team a lot there, because before that I was more on the propulsion side of things. So that kind of is what started this pivot for me. And
you said with the Matthew Sackwoods Fellowship, which for the viewers, it's a very famous fellowship that I guess is still not happening anymore, but it was, it pairs you with a mentor from the aerospace industry, and then also gives you the opportunity to intern with one of the new space companies out there. And you said, so your mentor was Hans or Tom?
Hans.
That's
Hans
awesome.
Königsmann.
He was one of the first avionics engineers at SpaceX, and was a VP until he retired recently.
The Matthew Sackwoods is actually coming back, but in a different form. It's now focused sort of on the space policy side of things.
Okay.
So if anybody's interested in policy, I highly recommend you to check it out. But unfortunately, the program that I was in has sort of ended.
Sure. Okay, so let's get to actually the stuff that you worked on at Space Capital and kind of your exploration of this new space industry. As you'd mentioned briefly, Starship is enabling a bunch of new businesses potentially in the future. What does that landscape look like, and what do those companies look like? How do you know which ones are viable?
Yeah. Okay. So I think just to give a perspective, I'm going to take a step back and explain how the commercial space industry and how space VC kind of came to be.
Sure.
So obviously, I mean, humans went into space for the first time in the 1950s and 60s. NASA got a ton of funding back then for geopolitical and other reasons. It was like the golden age of space, right? We're going over the moon and everything. But only countries and their respective government agencies were able to do any of that because of how costly it was. So that kind of dwindled out in the 1970s or so. NASA's budget was slashed many times over since the Apollo days, and just why we haven't gone back to the moon since then. And then, space kind of became this place that only government contractors could operate in. There was this contracting model called the cost-plus contracting, which basically guaranteed companies a certain profit margin, no matter how long they took on a project that they said, or how over budget they were. So you can imagine how this incentivizes, older aerospace primes, they're called, to maybe not move quite as fast as they could or make the most cost-effective decisions. And that was really the paradigm for decades, until there was a few companies before SpaceX that tried to break this model, but for decades, everyone was like, yeah, commercial space, that's not going to work. It's just too costly. Only these huge government contractors like Boeing, Lockheed, Northrop, these primes could go into space, until SpaceX really came in and kind of disrupted that whole thing. They basically were saying, well, how about instead of a cost-plus contract, we get a fixed-cost contract where we tell you how much we need to go and do this thing, and then we take that money and we do it. And pretty crazy.
And the commercial crew was the first one that, SpaceX was able to break that barrier with, right?
Yes, because the other one of that contract is Boeing with their Starliner, which we've seen has some issues and it's way over budget and over schedule as well. So that really opened up the doors for commercial space. SpaceX, with the Falcon 9, brought launch costs way down from what they were previously, which is really a huge barrier for companies to try and go build in space. On the investing side of things, SpaceX was really this wake-up call for a lot of investors. But what got investors really excited was in 2014 when the Skybox Imaging was acquired by Google for $500 million. Because that was the first commercial space exit, right? And as investors, what you're looking at is, it's sort of like gambling, right? Where you're evaluating these companies at super early stages that are incredibly risky, right? Like 90% of startups fail, and I'm sure it's more for space.
Yeah.
And you're taking that risk because there's a potential for an immense amount of return later down the line, right? So most companies that are funded by VCs won't exist in 5 years or something. But the ones that do and go on to win their whole market, like SpaceX, you get an incredible return on. So that first exit was this signal to investors like, hey, this is a place that we can actually make money, specifically venture capitalists and other private investors. So that's what really got this whole space, venture capital, and world going. Fast forward to 2021, just a kind of notable period as well. There was this SPAC craze, which basically means that you're trying to fundraise by putting yourself onto the stock market in a process called IPO, where you usually it's called IPO, where you go public to raise money. We had a few space companies go that route, and it was because COVID and the interest rates were down to zero, so it was basically free money. And since then, you can just see how well they're doing. Companies like Astra, Virgin Orbit, other ones are just, they overpromised and underdelivered. They didn't have the markets that they were saying they did. Their business just didn't make any sense. So that kind of cooled off interest in space companies from a public markets perspective, like how you and I could trade it on wherever. And now that's starting to come back into play. But anyway, the commercial space industry is, really in an incredible place right now, because there's a lot of different factors that are coming all at once that are helping each other to enable new use cases that can really have some exciting potential. Starship, again, is bringing these launch costs even further down. So I guess it'd be helpful to think about, what does space actually do for us right now? Right now, we got communications, which is a big one, Starlink. GPS is obviously a huge one as well. And also Earth observation. Those are the three applications that have sort of dominated and still dominate today the whole commercial space market. And when you think of space, you think of rockets and satellites, but launch is only a few $1 billion a year industry. The applications of what you do in space, GPS, data from imaging that helps inform maps, that's hundreds of billions of dollars.
Yeah.
Right. So space really is this useful from that unique vantage point that it provides up there. So there's all those three industries where there are new commercial space companies trying to redefine what we can do up there. There's a lot of Earth observation companies, and they've come and gone, some of them, but basically, like, how cheap can we make satellites that provide photos of wherever on Earth? And now we can see pretty much anywhere on Earth at any point in a day, and it's out there, and you can pay for it. Insights. Communications-wise, Starlink, OneWeb, Project Kuiper, that's connecting people to the grid that haven't been ever connected before. Stranis is another one of those. GPS, there's a few other ones that are trying to do new sorts of position, navigation, and timing applications as well. And then you have all these kind of emerging use cases, and this is where people get really excited. Space stations is one of those. The ISS is kind of going down in the 2030 and is going to have to be replaced pretty soon. So there's a lot of companies trying to go and build their own commercial space stations, and potentially then you could go and manufacture things on that. So in-space manufacturing is another one of these. Like, what can we make in space that is not possible to make on Earth? A company trying to do this right now is called Varda, and they are trying to basically say, okay, can we formulate new drugs in space? And, if they are able to find a drug that you can only make in space that is super useful down on Earth, that's billions of dollars a year as well. So there's all these potentials, use cases. That's the same thing with fiber optics. Without gravity in space, you can manufacture them much more with a much higher purity than down here on Earth. Asteroid mining, that's a bit out there, but it can definitely still be a thing. So there's a lot of these really exciting use cases that new companies are going after, but are still in their early phases right now.
And I have to say, I think apart from launch, which is I think the one that gains the most traction, especially with SpaceX being the big leader in that, seems like the field where there's most number of new space companies is Earth observation and like more in the satellite business. Mm-hmm. I think Planet was maybe the first one that again broke the barrier maybe like 10, 15 years ago.
Yep.
What are some other ones like Skybox Imaging that you mentioned that focus on like Earth observation and I think maybe even space domain awareness, which is kind of on the side, but similar in scope. What other companies are there?
Yeah, so Earth observation has gone through this cycle where you had this Earth observation 1.0 sort of companies, which is the planets. The companies that were around 10, 15 years ago, and they were ideally trying to sell a lot of this imagery that they get from space to commercial companies,
right,
for insights on how high are the oil wells in Saudi Arabia or wherever, then that could potentially inform a stock pick or some sort of trade on an oil company. Logistics is another one, right? You want to be able to track whatever you have. But they've sort of gone through this contraction where they've had to revert back to the government as the main customer. At the end of the day,
maybe?
Yeah. At the end of the day, a lot of space is defense, and you can't really get away from that. Every space company that's out there, in some shape or form, is getting either funding from or a contract from the defense industry because they're the ones that have really deep pockets and can pay for these sorts of insights and understand the imagery that they're getting from there. Now you have these next generation of Earth observation companies. One of these ones is called Albedo. They're super interesting because they're trying to fly their satellites really close to Earth, so in this orbit called VLEO. And the idea there is you can make them, you can make the image quality much higher because you're just closer to Earth, and everything also gets a little easier in terms of communications and things like that. Obviously, it comes with its complexities. There's a denser atmosphere that you have to deal with, but that's trying to bring the cost point down even farther and enable newer commercial applications like agriculture, is one of them. You can look at which crops are ready to be yielded, or maybe there's other ones like Muon Space, which is, again, it's kind of down the road here. They also build some imaging satellites. They've built one that looks at greenhouse gas emissions, and they're building one that's going to look at wildfires, right, which can detect these things much more early. So you can do a lot of different things with Earth observation. But the big question is whether or not you can get people to pay for it, right? Because if you give customers just an image, terabytes of images, right, which is what they have, it's not super useful for them, and they're not, going to spend the time to figure out how to derive insights from that. The question that people are trying to figure out right now is how do we get maybe AI or something like this to go through these images and actually get actionable insights for these businesses that they can use. Some of the ones that we were mentioning previously, maybe insurance, based on weather patterns or something like that. So that's a really new side of the EO industry that's pretty exciting.
Cool. Yeah, I also want to talk about the other thing that you mentioned was the future of what Starship could enable. And Tycho worked on this research report at Space Capital called The Next Giant Leap, which is an analysis of what Starship enables economically in the industry. Is that accurate? So if you could summarize this for us, like, what is the capability of Starship and where it can help? I'm a little biased because I also work on Starship. And this Starship is definitely something that we are pushing to succeed. But from my perspective, one of the main things that Starship has been contracted to do so far is the Artemis missions and getting humans back on the moon, because Starship is going to be the primary lunar lander for the next moon landing. But apart from that, there's a lot of companies, young companies, run by 20-somethings, 30-somethings, who are looking to capitalize on the fact that Starship allows for much more payload mass to space that previously was not capable. We were not capable of. So what do you see as like the main summary of what Starship enables at the new space?
So Starship is just a ginormous rocket.
Right, it is.
It's the largest rocket ever built, and it's 4x the payload and I think 3x the volume of any rocket that's ever been flown before. It can launch everything that we've launched to space as humans in 80 launches based on its payload capacity. Right? So this is like a step change in capability. Now, the price point is a little contentious. People saying that the launch costs are going to go to zero that's definitely not going to be the case, right? But SpaceX doesn't have any competition in this industry, pretty much, although that might be changing soon. So they really have no downward pressure on offering that price at a order of magnitude lower than it is right now. In this report, we go through and we kind of just say, give an estimate about maybe $100 million a Starship launch, which sort of lines up with how the Falcon 9 was priced back then. In the early days of Falcon 9, Elon and Gwen, they were saying basically that Falcon 9 was going to be single-digit millions, right? And they talked about how much they are going to save from reusing and everything. And it's true, they did. They have huge margins on Falcon 9. It's rumored basically that Falcon 9 cost them about $15 million on average, and they sell it for $70 million, right? So that's crazy good margins. They just haven't passed those margins on to the consumers, those savings, right? Because they have no reason to. So that's an important caveat to make. Like, just because Starship's a thing doesn't mean that people will be able to go buy this to actually go launch to space for a tenth of the price it is right now. That's not going to happen realistically, economically. But on the exciting side, like on the engineering side, this does change the game in how you think about how you're going to design what you want to go to space. Historically, mass has kind of, we talk about in this report, like the tyranny of mass efficiency, which is basically like, above all, mass is the thing that you need to optimize for, right? So you shave off a few grams here, for performance, like you have to do that. Or you don't bring an extra battery or reaction wheel or whatever because it's just too costly mass-wise. Starship flips that on its head. So instead of optimizing for mass, optimize for performance instead. you can maybe not have to design deployable things just because of how big it is. You can have looser tolerances on your manufacturing. So instead of making these really intricate and optimized satellites, you do these mass manufactured approach. So really what we talk about is how Starship enables this paradigm shift from like singular, exquisite, and expensive to mass-produced and low cost, basically. You want to create satellites and spacecraft to go into the Starship in a similar way that SpaceX has built the Starship rocket itself. All right, they've gone from rockets being these super exquisite and one-time use things to now they want to build rockets like you just roll them off the manufacturing line, you launch them, and you catch them, you launch them again.
Yeah.
And because of the economies of scale of that, it enables so much more. So that's the real power of Starship. Now, as far as what the customers are going to be, you mentioned one of them. NASA is the huge one. Artemis is a huge customer for Starship for landing humans on the moon and potentially bringing cargo there and back. The DoD is obviously going to be another one too. They're definitely going to be interested in its new capabilities for putting up their own satellites. And then Starlink is the other anchor customer. Starlink, is already at 7,000, 8,000 satellites, and they have plans to go to 40,000 satellites, and then these satellites have to be replaced every 5 years. So they pretty much need Starship in order to make this use case, to make Starlink viable by putting up enough satellites to replace them every year. And eventually, the idea is Starlink is kind of this flywheel that allows SpaceX to go to Mars, right? Because that's the ultimate goal. Starship is built to land on Mars. That's also very important to highlight. It's not optimized to go to LEO. It's not optimized to do in-space transportation. It's built to go to Mars, right? Based on its stainless steel, based on using methane. So that's the ultimate goal of SpaceX. And Starlink is this funding mechanism to send Starship to Mars. So those are your three anchor customers. Then you can think about, okay, what other new use cases make sense to go and fill this volume, right? And something that one startup that I think shows this really well is Reflect Orbital, which basically is reflecting sunlight from space down onto Earth onto solar farms after dusk. And in order for that to make any sense on a unit economics basis, you have to send up thousands and thousands and thousands of these satellites, which you can only do with Starship.
Right.
But the reason why I'm highlighting that one is because it actually addresses this large terrestrial market that people would pay for, right? If you can offer electricity at night, they would sell to these electricity providers at a lower cost than you can by using oil and gas during the night. That's great. That's great for the environment, right? And it's great for customers. So that could be a potential use case for Starship where it actually makes sense, we can send thousands of these things up into space. Obviously, that brings with it its problems on the orbital debris side and space sustainability and all that as well. But those are the kinds of things that are really exciting. I mentioned also in-space manufacturing and Varda. If you can put factories in space, and then Starship, a key part about Starship is that it comes back down, right? It re-enters. We've never really had things go up into space, come back down, besides capsules. Yeah, capsules for humans, and the point of that was to bring humans there and back. We've never had things to go up into space and bring back down. What can you actually do with that capability? What can you make in space at this huge scale that can make sense for you to sell back down on Earth? So those are the kinds of things that we're really excited about and we kind of dive into in that report.
I know another company that is trying to shift the paradigm from small, very exquisitely designed, as you said, satellites to large, more capable satellites that are maybe don't need very intricate parts. Is K2 Space?
Yep.
Seems like they're. What do you know about them, and what are they working on? That can benefit.
We talk about them in the report too, so you're right on the nose. But K2 is again part of this new shift of how can we, if we throw out our mass constraint out the window, what can we make a satellite look like?
Right.
I think their solar panels are just 3 times as thick as any other solar panel in the industry, because it allows them to get this incredible power, which is useful for some sort of synthetic aperture radar and other imaging use cases, the increased power. And that's only possible because they're eventually planning to go on Starship. They're going to go on Falcon 9 originally, but Starship is the enabler at the end for that. So reimagining, like you said, going from exquisite, super expensive satellites to these large, maybe, they're not lower quality, but less optimized satellites, which are much cheaper to make, but able to deliver even higher performance due to Starship. So K2 is one of those. Apex is another one that's following a similar kind of line, where they're going like, okay, how do we apply this mass manufacturing mentality that SpaceX is doing for Starship to satellite buses? How can we commoditize satellite buses and be transparent about our prices in order to enable, again, these thousands of satellites going up into space? Because right now we don't have, as a country, the capability to produce thousands of satellite buses reliably and in a time frame that is, makes sense. So there's a few companies in that vein.
Sweet. And on that topic, I also want to showcase another resource that Tycho's given us here, is what he's calling the New Space Guide to the Galaxy. I don't know if it's visible, but we'll also post this in our next newsletter, if that's okay.
Of course.
And so this has a list of, books, media, resources, and I think a list of companies as well that, separated by industry and what they're doing. Do you want to summarize what's on this really quickly? Like maybe the newsletters or books that are most impactful for you here.
Yeah, let me take a look. I can highlight some of the ones that I think are really amazing. So the first things are like ecosystem maps, like getting an idea of like what is out there.
Yes.
It's very helpful for when you hear company names and you be like, oh yeah, right, they do this. So there's a bunch of resources that do this and basically separate companies out into different sections. And like I mentioned, we have like kind of more infrastructure side of things. Then you have applications, which is more like how do we use GPS signals and things like that. So there's different ways to segment the industry to better understand it. So those are some helpful links there. The books. The Space Economy, I'm a shameless plug, but this is written by the guy who founded Space Capital, Chad Anderson, and it's a fantastic guide onto, this emerging commercial space industry, really in depth, and I highly recommend that one as an intro. When the Heaven Went on Sale by Ashley Vance is a great book that looks into the beginnings of Planet, Astra, and Rocket Lab.
And Firefly as well.
Oh, yeah, and Firefly. And there's actually a documentary on HBO, too, called Wild Wild Space, which is really entertaining if you prefer that medium as well. And then the two books by Eric Berger on SpaceX are really incredible deep dives into the early days of SpaceX, but then also how do we get Falcon 9 to go and land. So those are great views into the leading
I got to
space
say,
company.
I've read at least when the Heavens Went on Sale, Liftoff and Reentry. All great books, but I think Liftoff specifically, really, put a big emphasis on how hard space is and kind of all the struggles that the early employees of SpaceX had to go through just to get a really tiny Falcon 1 rocket, up into space and to kickstart this era of new space. And then, I think Reentry covers more of the commercial crew and really the first time SpaceX was competing directly with the aerospace primes and how that then changed the industry. Great books overall. One thing, I guess, is there anything else you want to say about the New Space Guide? Like one last thing?
Media companies, Payload Space is really incredible. They do newsletters every week highlighting the best, fundraising around what's going on in space. Payload Space and Space News are the places to go for those for sure. And these guys all have podcasts and everything as well. So
cool. And I guess one last thing is for those, as someone who is a professional engineer but also has worked on the more business side, more space capital side of things, what advice would you give for someone else who's interested, who's an engineer but is interested in kind of going into this space capital side of things?
Space is hard. Starting a space startup is even harder. I think the most productive way to go about this entrepreneurship way, especially in space has had this, tendency to have cool technology but not many customers. Where you have this tech and you say, oh, it'll be great when I build this amazing satellite that does this thing. And then you go and try and sell it and you realize, oh wait, nobody wants to pay for that thing.
Yeah.
We really need to flip that around, where we find, okay, here's problems that customers are willing to pay to fix, or some kind of capability that customers on the Earth are willing to pay for, and then how can we go and build space companies that go and do that from space infrastructure? So, for people that are interested in this field, I definitely recommend thinking about what the end customers are first, rather than the actual space technology. I mean, because the space technology is amazing, right? It's really incredible, and as engineers, we're really excited by that. But the question of who's going to actually pay for it is really big. So, space applications for large terrestrial markets. That's the big thing, because the in-space economy is really at the beginning right now, and there's a lot of space companies that are trying to sell to other space companies, which is kind of like, they're trying to sell pickaxes to miners that haven't found the gold yet.
Yeah.
That's not saying that the people won't find the gold, right? There won't be some drug that makes, the use case of Varda make sense, or asteroid mining makes sense. But we haven't really yet gotten to the stage where all these space companies serving each other is an economically viable thing. So really think about, if you're trying to create in the space, how can you solve terrestrial problems using space?
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think one exciting thing for students and those who are currently in college or thinking about going into the space industry, maybe 20, 30 years ago, it really would have been maybe Boeing, Lockheed, Northrop. And of course, now everyone is aware of SpaceX, maybe even Rocket Lab. But I think what Tycho has highlighted here is that there's actually dozens and dozens of younger companies who are all trying to, succeed and become economically viable and useful in this new era of space. And these are all also potential hirers of, new aerospace professionals who are coming to the industry right now. Or if you want to start your own, it seems like that is also something that investors are really open to these days.
Definitely. We're in this golden age of space. And space is this beautiful industry where it's pretty small, where people know each other. But really what makes it unique is that people that are working in space are passionate about space. A lot of them could go and do whatever kind of other job to make more money, usually. So space is this really passionate field. And especially as for trying to find internships or jobs, I definitely recommend reaching out to people in these new space companies, because they love to talk about what they do, right? And that's the best way to get your foot in the door for any sort of interview, potentially, or anything. It doesn't even have to be for an interview. Just talk to these people that are doing jobs that you find exciting, and you'll get so much out of that.
Cool. Yeah, I think we're going to wrap up soon. I guess, Tycho, do you have any closing statements or things you want our viewers to know?
I think that's it.
Cool. Awesome. I think that's our show for today. We'll definitely post Tycho's New Space Guide to the Galaxy. Again, incredible links, resources, and a list of all the exciting new companies that are out there. And I guess this podcast will also go out very soon. Thank you guys for listening / watching, and we hope to see you next time.
Thanks.
Cool.
Nice job, guys.